So
Right.
it's kind of a neutral, and it's up to you to make sense, and that's where maybe the rereading comes in, the context. You know, in a given year I might read that and go, yeah, I know how that is, that sucks.
Right,
you know?
right,
and,
yeah.
And later, as I get older or whatever, it's more about the internal versus the external.
Right.
So I like the idea of the context changing, and maybe more so with the written word, because I think of like an art form that's visual for me. I put it up on the wall, I like it or I don't, I'm not sure why.
Right.
I'm less likely to try to give it meaning.
Interesting.
And that's why, yeah, I really like the idea of revisiting.
Right,
You know?
right.
And being it is simple, like the one with the frost, where there's a lot of different stuff going on, that's maybe even richer with possibility.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Well, it's just quite a bit longer, yeah. Yeah, I would agree with all of that. You know, I think that our own experience and mood is going to color our interpretation of a poem like that, which is not to say the poem is just a blank slate onto which we project ourselves, but many different moods and hues and interpretations, I think, are present often in the same poem. And we know that they're mostly good, and we know that they remember with both twinklings and twinges. But I think if we decide that it's a poem that's principally about the love between these two, then that's something that we're inferring from other you know, phrases or words, and the choice of them and the order in which they're placed. But that's it is very subjective. Showing that poem to a class full of students, you can get. I had one you know, adult student who was just so resistant to the drift that the conversation was taking, that was emphasizing the poverty in the poem, you know, as I do when I talk about it, and as others do. They eat beans mostly, it's what they can afford. They're old, but it's their rented back room. Like, these are facts of their life, this material poverty, but she didn't want the sense of richness and abundance and completeness even that she sensed in their lives to be overshadowed by this, oh, they're old and poor and black and they've been oppressed all their lives and things like that. For her, it was really a poem of abundance, and for me, it's really both, and I think that's the wonderful thing about it. I'd say that probably for her, it's both too, and that the ironic complementarity of those two things, you know, that you can have poverty and abundance simultaneously, you know, but you could get a whole class of kids going, tastes great, less filling, you know, or poverty, abundance, you know, arguing and shouting and shaking their fists back and forth, because the poem is that complex, for sure, yeah. And it's one of its great gifts to us, I think. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm curious about, I'm not exactly sure how to put it, the genderness of poetry. Because I think poetry is what connects head and heart together, harmonically somehow. That men have more trouble with poetry than women have, or men are not as drawn to poetry as women are. Is there any research about that, or do you have any thoughts about that?
I don't. There's certainly, boy, and I don't know that there's anything I could say about it that wouldn't be almost irresponsible. You know, I think that the fact that the Norton Anthology is so much more full, or has been historically, of male poets than of female poets is much more a function of the fact that it's been a lot harder for a woman poet to get published and to get attention and to be taken seriously throughout most of the history of the English language than it, you know, hopefully and thankfully is becoming. There's certainly, I think it's something that's been pursued and embraced and shared by men and women in large numbers through the years. So I don't know. I guess maybe gender is a little too sort of indeterminate a concept maybe for me to attach anything to it. I will say this, that a disproportionate number of great poets are gay for whatever reason. I don't know why that is, but and that might be an interesting thing to study, and I'm sure it has been studied in the past, but it's remarkable how many incredibly gifted poets and influential poets.
What's the gender split in your classroom?
You know, it's about equal, I think, in beginning poetry writing. I think it's about 50-50. You know, I should look at my class roll for this semester and see, but I don't feel that in beginning or advanced poetry I get more men or more women necessarily, and I don't know that the institution where I teach is more, either gender is more represented. Yeah, so it's an interesting question. Yeah. I'm a dude, but really learned poetry. My first big influence was probably my mom, who was sharing poetry with me and who had brought it to me from her grandmother. You know, that's sort of the lineage of loving poetry in my family, and so maybe I associate it sort of with both sides for that reason. Yeah, it's an interesting thought. I'd be interested in what research might say about that. Yeah, go ahead.
I don't read poetry as much as I need to. I keep thinking I need to really go after it, but
You've got that guilt I was talking about.
I love what it does to me.
Good.
It draws me inside myself.
Yeah.
I get more introspective, and I get insights that maybe I've always known, but someone finally puts the words to it so I can claim it fully, or
Yes.
more fully.
Yes.
And it is amazing. You've probably identified a problem that I would have if I really vigorously get after it, that I'd have to read 100 poems to find one that would really touch me.
Right, yeah. Yeah, but those 100 though, you forget them, you know, and you just move on, and you don't. I tend to beat your head against them indefinitely if you're really genuinely not enjoying the experience of reading them. It's okay to quit halfway through. This isn't homework, you know. You know, it's good to give things a chance if they seem to deserve a chance.
Well, I subscribe to Writer's Almanac on the internet.
Yeah.
So there's a poem every day, so I read a poem every day.
Those services that give you, like the website Poetry Daily, or the Poem in Your Pocket, the Poem a Day that the Academy of American Poets gives you, or Writer's Almanac, where Garrison Keillor presents a different poem, or has in the past. I don't know if that
Every day, every column starts off with a poem.
That's a great way to get exposed, while listening to the radio, you're not even reading, to one poem per day. And if, you know, and it may months go by, but then one day in the middle of June, he'll say some poem that'll just knock your socks off.
Absolutely.
And you'll then have the poet's name, and you can go read that poem on the corresponding website, and then you can go to the library and find a book of poems by that poet and immerse yourself in their work specifically. That's a great way to sort of narrow it, rather than just pulling books at random off the shelves and trying to find ones that you hope will work for you.
Well, one of my favorite poems is The Cremation of Sam McGee.
Oh, yeah.
Which is another genre, but I heard it first from my father.
Yeah.
And now I've learned it, so I've been able to recite it.
That's not great. Yeah, recitation is just it's one of my favorite things to do. Yeah, go ahead.
So do you speak other languages?
Embarrassingly, no, I really don't.
Yeah, just I'm curious. You know, I'm from Japan. So, for instance, if you use different language, it's maybe different word or
Yes.
different dimension,
Yes.
or maybe some of the overlap. But you know, just I was thinking.
I think that's absolutely true, and you know, language is the tool with which we construe the world in our experience. And if you're
Even
limited to
in
one
translate, maybe it's impossible to same thing. It's different.
Yes, yeah. Translation of poetry is, and I have, with the help of friends who are fluent in Spanish, I've translated some poetry from Spanish into English, and translating poetry particularly is a challenge for that very reason that I was saying, that it's not language intended to have a single, clear, unambiguous meaning. It's language that's meant to be an entire rich experience of its own, and that's probably why Robert Frost said, poetry is what gets lost in translation. A translation is always, of a poem is always going to be a failure. Ideally, it will be a noble failure, but it's doomed to be an incomplete process. Yeah. I wish that I had better enriched my experience of life with Spanish. My mom was a Spanish professor, with any other language, but Spanish is the one that I had clearly the best opportunity to have mastered. And we even lived in Mexico one summer, and I wish I had gone there on my own and had an immersion experience. When we were in Mexico when I was a kid, I was surrounded by Spanish, but whenever it was time to speak, my mom would do the speaking because she was the fluent one, and so I was never forced to try and fail and try again and acquire language in that way. What did I see? Oh yeah, go ahead.
Well, your first poem brought back to my memory one of my most vivid experiences. It was in 1965, and I'd been a professor at KU for 12 years, but I was fortunate enough to get a Fulbright appointment at the Technische Hochschule in Stuttgart, Germany.
Wonderful.
So I'd ridden across the ocean on the boat and taken the train from England to Stuttgart. In the first week, I somehow became aware that I was supposed to go to the police station and fill out a form. And so I walked down the block, they gave me the form, I sat down at the desk, and the very first question was, what was your address on August 31st, 1939?
Wow.
Well, at that time, I was in junior high in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And here I was, an American citizen, American passport, Fulbright professor, but the hackles just went up and down my spine.
Oh my gosh.
Because I recognized the significance of the date.
Right.
And to think that they were still asking that sort of question.
That's fascinating.
Amazing.
That is amazing, yeah. That poem will be haunting as long as humans can read
Yeah.
English, I think.
Yeah.
And you mentioned, Phil, the sense of turning inward, and the way that poetry sort of stills you and makes you more reflective. I mean, and I think that's one reason that I wanted to turn to that poem and to poetry generally in this past week. Maybe some of us have had this experience in the past week where we've felt, and I mean this really seriously, like if I look at social media or the news, like I may succumb to a paralyzing depression, you know? This has been a real concern of mine, and I've wanted language that didn't obfuscate. I've wanted language that I didn't feel was really trying to manipulate me in any particular way, didn't have designs on me, other than to speak the honest truth from a human being's heart as eloquently as possible. It's been a good week to turn to poetry, and as bleak as that poem is, I mean, it's relentlessly bleak. I'm sorry for inflicting that on you all right after lunch. As bleak as that poem is, it's humanizing, isn't it, to hear someone speak that truthfully and that powerfully, and you're just grateful that someone said it, you know, you're just grateful that someone said it.
We're grateful that you said it. You
Thank you.
interpreted it very well.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to. As I say, I've never said it before, and this gave me a good occasion to finish memorizing it too, so, yes, go ahead.
It's not so much a question, but I've been surrounded by poetry one way or another ever since I was a little thing. And in fact, I kind of thought of the songs of Stephen Foster more for the words than the music.
Sure.
And they are poetic if
Yes.
you stop to think about it.
Yes.
But when I think I started writing some poetry of my own when I was around third grade or so. And kept at it rather frequently until one year when I was, I don't know, I was in first or second year of college, I think. One day the muse just simply up and left and never came back. I don't know why. But some of what you were saying, you talked about the old couple, reminded me of my college professor, who mostly taught the history of music, but he also wrote poems, and he self-published a book called Bascom Falls, and about his upbringing in childhood in Appalachia. And there were a couple of lines in that kind of clicked here with what you were saying. One of them talking about his family life. He was brought up by his grandma and his Aunt Polly because his mother died young. And he was talking about this one line is grandma and agriculture. No shit, no roses. And by the way, Aunt Polly was black. And then I first read that and I, oh my goodness. But, because I never would have guessed that.
Right.
But, at any rate, a lot of, just the things he wrote, and I saw sort of like a connection there, like very much alike.
Thank you. You know, people ask when, you know, what I trace my interest in poetry to, or when I first started thinking about myself as a poet. And I can't really name a particular point, but I often say that poetry for me, I think of as an extension of a lifelong interest in speech and in talking. And I've always been a talker. And Auden, you know, who you know, has come up a couple times already, his definition of poetry was memorable speech. And Coleridge's was the best words in their best order. I like those definitions. Frost called it a momentary stay against confusion. If you think of a poem not as words in verse lines on a page, but as the best words in their best order, or even more broadly as memorable speech, then it liberates you to recognize poetry that's in the world all around you, in prose books and books of poetry, but also in lines of dialogue, in movies and plays and TV shows, and in good jokes that you heard, and in just the wonderful colloquialisms that people use in their everyday speech from parts of the country that you're unfamiliar with. This is a terrific ways of expressing things efficiently and ingeniously and using metaphor that are in everyone's speech. Whether they think they're interested in poetry or not. What I heard somebody say the other day, she's as crazy as a soup sandwich. You know, that's fantastic. It's so short and efficient and so complete. I'm not even going to do it injustice by describing why it's great, because I couldn't, and also because you know, humor is like a possum. You kill it by dissecting it, or you know, you have to kill it in order to dissect it. So. But that's poetry to me. You know, that she's as crazy or he's as crazy as a soup sandwich is a better line than most of the contemporary poetry you would read if you just opened a random literary journal, you know. And so, yeah, finding poetry in the world around you.
We need to conclude, but I want to share an experience this week I've had. I've been digesting all the editorials about the election. And it just, I love the hymnology of Christianity, and a hymn rose up in me, a mighty hymn that just melted this anxiety away. And it is the hymn, "This is my Father's world." Wow, just was wonderful. Because I've been telling people for months that I have a new disorder, political anxiety disorder, PAD.
Yeah.
And this hymn just went through me like cleanser. Get it out of my system.
If you start a PAD support group, I want to be in on it. That's you and me both, yeah. And we'll sing that hymn at every meeting.
I want to say, Eric, I am so happy you are the poet laureate of our great state.
Oh, thank you very much. It's really my pleasure. Thank you again so much for having me.
And I'm thrilled that you get a sabbatical after all this.
I'm thrilled about that too, yeah. Hope to get some writing done. So thank you again, everyone.
Well,
Yeah.
one of the last lines of
yeah,
the music of the
Have to borrow a pen.
I've got one over.
Oh, you do?
in that hymn. And while as a physicist,